My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today, that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. This week I was listening to the United Nations reports on climate change, the climate crises which we are in, and from which many people are suffering. And I heard a young 16-year-old girl from Sweden named Greta Thunberg give a talk. And in that talk, she said that if the older generation, the power elite of the older generation, do not take responsibility for their actions and do something to mitigate the damage that they have done and are doing to the environment, then her generation of young people will never forgive them. And I thought to myself that if I were speaking to Greta Thunberg, I would say to her, the power elite you are referring to don't care about forgiveness. Now, what may be a reason, among other reasons, for the United States and Europe and some Asian countries not acting to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions is their worldview. In order to fully appreciate what I am about to say, you've got to accept some facts. European and United States history that we are most aware of underscores the willingness of the ruling elite of all previous generations, including this one, to kill and to murder to obtain their economic and political objectives. They are not guided by a moral paradigm. So when I talk about worldview, I am referring to the religious and ideological rationalizations which make world powers comfortable killing and murdering people, whether they be children, the elderly, or simply everyday working people. For example, I remember in 1996 hearing then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright rationalize the killing and or murdering of 500,000 Iraqi children under U.S. sanctions in Iraq at that time. She said that the objective of the United States made it necessary, and so therefore she brushed it off as being acceptable. She did not consider ethical or moral issues whatsoever. Now, today, the same rationalization is used in regard to Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Zimbabwe, all of which are under sanctions and whose populations are suffering. Innocent children, their mothers, the elderly. Now, for the power elite, understand this. They're like an addict. They're like a crack addict or a heroin addict. And there's an old saying, more is never enough. More killing and more murder is never enough at home or abroad to secure for them their power and to expand it. So let me enumerate what some rationales are that are used by the power elite. First, I want to just briefly define social Darwinism, which is one of their rationales. Social Darwinists assume that Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection is a law of the organic world, just as gravity is assumed true by physicists. Sometimes natural selection is referred to as evolution. Darwin emphasized competition, fitness, and adaptation as three of several mechanisms which drive natural selection. He did not believe that God exists. He did not factor into his analysis of natural selection the idea or existence of God. He drew that conclusion being natural selection, based upon his observations of the natural world alone. Some sociologists adapted his theory and applied it to society, and to this day, many of them still do. Natural selection, when applied socially, is interpreted or was interpreted by some sociologists like Herbert Spencer to mean that only the strong survive. Now, Charles Darwin never really said that. That phrase was coined by Herbert Spencer, an English sociologist. In nature, there is no morality, and among animals, only dominance or subordination determine who will and who will not reproduce offspring, who will and who will not be poor or rich, who will or who will not live or die under some circumstances. Those are the considerations. They argue that socially impaired people, for instance, whether they be physically or mentally impaired, should not be supported by government welfare. Rather, they argue that poor people should be allowed to fail at reproducing offspring, or at least allowed to suffer a shorter lifespan than what is normal. Thomas Malthus made that argument. Republicans today generally believe and practice social Darwinism in its various forms, especially in foreign affairs. And Democrats, though they claim not to be social Darwinists, they practice social Darwinism in foreign affairs and as imps for corporate America. Eventually, social Darwinism spun off into a new theory in the 19th century. It is called eugenics. So this is the second rationale used by the power elite to justify their actions, their immoral, unethical actions. Eugenicists assume that some people are genetically defective and should be euthanized or legally prohibited from reproducing offspring. The idea of eugenics is historically rooted in social theories argued by the philosophers Aristotle and Plato. They both argued that defective infants should be killed at birth. Now, in the city of Sparta, the Greek Spartans applied that rule. Defective infants were taken from their mothers and killed at birth by exposure. The modern practice of infanticide was later argued by Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Francis Galton argued that some people are genetically inferior both physically and intellectually, or physically or intellectually, and that they should be legally prohibited from reproducing offspring. So for him, you may be physically fine, but classified as an imbecile or retarded or a moron. And for him, that was evidence that qualified you to be legally prohibited from reproducing offspring. Conversely, he argued that some people or races are genetically, that is, physically and intellectually superior, that they should be encouraged to reproduce offspring. His theory was accepted by both state and federal judicial institutions in the United States, including the United States Supreme Court. In the United States, under eugenical laws for involuntary sterilization, people classified as being defective were sterilized for decades, thousands and thousands of people. In California, over 20,000 people were involuntarily sterilized. That was practiced in the 20th century by the Germans on black Namibians in South Africa and during the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler in Germany. They sterilized or euthanized over 400,000 Germans, classified as genetically unfit. Many states have since apologized for what they now recognize as having been horrific state policies, but it was how they rationalized their policies at the time which to this day they fail to grasp because they continue to see the world through the same paradigms, supported by the same assumptions about the nature of human life. So their killings and murderous behavior has only been directed to different targets. Now, I've given you two so-called rational or scientific rationales for the murderous behavior of the federal government that we live under and the European governments, as well as Asian governments. But there is a religious facet to our problem as well. Some of you may cringe at what I'm about to say. But what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the existence of God. Put that to the side for a moment. In fact, let's assume God exists. So what we're going to do is examine for one moment how a new version of Christianity was formed that was godless. Most Christian denominations spawned from that morphed form of Christianity are racist in America. And had they not been racist, then American history would be completely different than what it is or what it was. Native Americans would not have been subject to genocide. There would have been no slavery, and the Constitution would not include certain amendments and clauses and articles. Now, when I say that most Christian denominations are racist, I mean both black Christian denominations and white Christian denominations. Black Christians are dependent on a theology spawned by white denominations. 99% of all the literature read in black churches are written by white theologians who promote the idea of white superiority or white supremacy. Now, historically, you may wonder, well, where did this come from? Early in the 16th century, Portuguese trading companies introduced into Europe an Aryan form of racism that they brought with them from India. Thereafter, Christian intellectuals morphed their religious ideology into a religious form of Christianity we call white supremacy. White supremacy is a religion. They did that in conjunction with the emergence of European colonialism. So, here we have the ideology now, a Christian form of white supremacy to rationalize colonization, enslavement, the exploitation of non-European people, justifying it, just as Madeleine Albright, in her mind, feels justified having murdered 500,000 children in Iraq. As an institution, Christian thought assumed an ancient Indian Aryan myth of white supremacy, derived from the law code of Manu, M-A-N-U. They argued then, as they do now, that God is a white man, and they are very serious about it. They believe that. Christians assume white supremacy both indirectly and subconsciously through their religious imagery and symbolism. All one need do is look at the imagery and look at the symbolism. It's in your face. Most people are informed by and participate with one another subconsciously through shared imagery and symbolism. If you look at the mass media, that is generally what they communicate, imagery and symbolism. imagery, and symbolism to involve you in their symbolic world of meaning. Now, subconsciously, their religious imagery and symbolism reinforce white supremacist beliefs because that imagery and symbolism suggests to them that white race identity is paramount over all other so-called races. That is what the Portuguese brought with them from India to Europe and applied in Brazil as the Spanish applied it in Latin America. For them, in their imaginary symbolic bubble, truth is not a factor. What is real, though, are the consequences of their behavior. So though their belief is false, when they act upon it, it is real in its consequences. And that is what we are concerned about. All three groups I have mentioned are going to act in relation to climate change, but not the way you may think they'll act. So what kind of act am I referring to? Acts of omission. Or, to put it in a popular political mantra, never let a good crisis go to waste. You should assume that corporate America knows that climate scientists' warnings about global warming are on point and that we are on course to run to extinction if we do not reverse our economic lifestyles. They know that. They hire top scientists. They have top engineers from top universities, and they know the science. Donald Trump knows the science. He is the president of the United States and has access to every scientific agency of this nation. And all he need do is pick up his phone and say, come to my office and explain to me what's happening in the North Pole with the ice cap. Come to me and explain to me what's happening with the polar vortex. Come to me and explain to me what's happening with global dimming. And he would have an office full of experts giving him the data that no one else has access to because it is kept secret from the public. Now, the leaked ExxonMobil memorandum that I'm showing you right now makes it clear that Exxon executives were formally made aware by their engineers that what their company was doing could make the earth uninhabitable for humans in less than 100 years. So it's not just government that has the data. It's not just the experts and the agents of the president who know the facts, who know what is happening to our planet. Corporate America also have facts, and they've generated reports. This one happened to leak out. And so now we're aware that as early as the late 70s, Exxon was aware that what they were doing was damaging our planet irreparably. They know that the northern hemisphere of our planet will initially be hit less than the southern hemisphere of the planet. Now listen closely. They know that the southern hemisphere is primarily populated by people of color. Europe, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil will not act to limit global warming or CO2 emissions. They will not act to mitigate the damage because they are addicted to the economies that they have fashioned and the lifestyle of power, of the power elite that is patterned after the lifestyles of Bronze Age dictators 5,000 years ago. Their acts of omission will cause billions of human beings to die over the next 90 years, primarily in the equatorial and southern hemispheres of the planet. That in turn will cause a steep decline in the human population. Demographers are pointing at that projection right now, and you can do the same calculations. That is why they refuse to cut emissions. They're profiting by their lifestyles, and they think that they can economically benefit from climate change. For example, they have always supported policies aimed at a reduction in human population, especially in the non-developed nations and in non-white populations in the United States as well. What that means is that more people in Africa, more people in Asia, and more poor people in the United States will die due to the adverse effects of climate change. And it has already started and will only accelerate. There is a proverb that I've always remembered since I was a boy. It says, and I quote, "Study the ant and become wise." I agree with that. But before I close, I want to add something else for you to study. We are genetically more similar to rats and mice than we are to ants. In fact, we share 92% of our genes with rats. So if you want to understand why the elite, the power elite through our government, kills and murders babies without conscience, both at home and abroad, and why they refuse to act to mitigate CO2 emissions by both acts, they continue to do it, and acts of omissions, they refuse to initiate policies that would mitigate the amount of CO2 emissions being spewed into the atmosphere every day, then you had better study rats. You had better study gutter rats. If you do that study, then you'll understand exactly what you are dealing with. Greta Thunberg, they are evil. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.
I really enjoyed this video, and I hope you did as well. If you enjoyed Stephen's talk, please support this channel, thumbs up, and share this video. And please do not forget to subscribe.